December 20th, 1968, 10:15 p.m. Two people park on a quiet road near Vallejo, California. A car pulls up behind them. A man gets out. He approaches the vehicle. What happens in the next moments will launch one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. For 55 years, this case has remained cold. The perpetrator, who called himself the Zodiac, committed confirmed crimes in Northern California between 1968 and 1969. He sent taunting letters to newspapers. He created cryptograms. He claimed responsibility for additional crimes that were never definitively connected to him. And then, after a final letter in 1974, the communications stopped. The case went cold. Decades passed. Investigators retired. Evidence sat in storage. The identity of the Zodiac became one of America's greatest mysteries, analyzed by amateur sleuths, profilers, and investigators who dedicated careers to solving it. But despite thousands of hours of work, despite advances in forensic technology, despite all the attention this case has received, the Zodiac has never been identified. Until now, everything about this investigation has been based on evidence collected in 1968 and 1969 using the forensic technology available at the time. Fingerprints that were lifted but never matched anyone. Handwriting samples that were analyzed but never definitively attributed. Physical evidence that was documented but never yielded the breakthrough investigators needed. But in 2024 and 2025, something fundamental has changed. Evidence that's been sitting in storage for 55 years is being re-examined with technology that didn't exist when these crimes occurred. Technology that's already solved cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s. Technology that can extract information from evidence that was considered fully analyzed decades ago. DNA analysis methods that can pull genetic profiles from touch DNA on stamps and envelopes. Genealogical databases that can identify suspects through distant relatives. Advanced fingerprint analysis that can find details in old prints that weren't visible with 1960s technology. Handwriting analysis powered by artificial intelligence that can compare samples against millions of documents. For 55 years, the evidence collected in 1968 and 1969 has been waiting for forensic science to catch up, waiting for databases to grow large enough, waiting for someone to apply modern technology to old evidence. That wait might finally be over. Multiple law enforcement agencies are actively working this case right now with 2025 technology. Evidence is being tested. DNA is being analyzed. New investigative techniques are being applied to evidence that was collected when Richard Nixon was president. This case has been cold for 55 years, but it's not frozen, and in 2025, it might finally be solved. Before we go any further, I need to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Seriously, drop your location in the comments. Are you in California? Somewhere else in the United States? Another country? I want to see how far this story is reaching. How many people still care about solving a case that's been cold for more than half a century? And if you believe that no case is too old to solve, that 55 years isn't too long to wait for justice, that families deserve answers even decades later, you need to subscribe to Cold Case right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single update, and smash that like button because it pushes this story to more people who need to hear it. We specialize in cases that law enforcement forgot, cases that went cold, cases where families have been waiting decades for answers. We dig into the evidence, we follow the new technology, we track the breakthroughs that are finally bringing these forgotten victims justice. This case has been cold for 55 years, but the evidence never disappeared. And in 2025, that evidence is finally being examined with the technology it's been waiting for. Technology that solved other cases from the 1960s and 1970s. Technology that could finally identify the Zodiac after more than half a century. Now, let's dive into exactly what evidence exists from 1968 and 1969, and what modern technology is being applied to it right now in 2025. When investigators processed the crime scenes and evidence in 1968 and 1969, they did everything they could with the technology available. They collected fingerprints from multiple locations. They preserved letters and envelopes sent by the perpetrator. They documented physical evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They followed every lead. The investigation produced substantial physical evidence. Letters written by someone claiming to be the perpetrator, envelopes that had been sealed by licking, stamps that had been affixed with saliva, fingerprints on letters and on a vehicle, witness descriptions, handwriting samples, physical evidence from crime scenes. All of this evidence was collected, documented, and preserved. It's been sitting in evidence storage for 55 years. And here's the crucial point. Much of that evidence has never been fully analyzed with modern technology. It was analyzed with 1960s and 1970s technology, which had severe limitations compared to what's available today. Let me break down what that means and why evidence from 55 years ago is being re-examined right now. First, the letters and envelopes. The person claiming to be the Zodiac sent multiple letters to Bay Area newspapers between 1969 and 1974. These letters contained details about the crimes, threats of future violence, and cryptograms. The letters were handwritten. The envelopes were addressed by hand, sealed, and stamped. When these letters arrived in 1969, investigators examined them for fingerprints. They analyzed the handwriting. They looked for any physical evidence that could identify the sender. But in 1969, DNA analysis didn't exist. The concept of extracting genetic information from saliva on stamps and envelope seals wasn't even theoretically possible. In 2025, it is. Modern DNA analysis can extract genetic profiles from incredibly small amounts of biological material. The saliva used to seal envelopes in 1969 contains DNA. The saliva used to affix stamps contains DNA. If the Zodiac licked those envelopes and stamps, his DNA is on them. And that DNA has been sitting there preserved for 55 years. In 2025, forensic laboratories are using techniques that can extract DNA from degraded samples, from tiny amounts of biological material, from evidence that's decades old. The letters and envelopes from the Zodiac case are being re-examined with these modern techniques. DNA is being extracted. Profiles are being generated. And those profiles are being compared against genealogical databases that didn't exist in 1969, databases that now contain genetic information from more than 30 million people. This is exactly how the Golden State Killer was identified in 2018. DNA from crime scenes in the 1970s and 1980s was uploaded to genealogical databases. Partial matches to distant relatives were found. Genetic genealogists built family trees. And eventually, a suspect was identified after 44 years. That same methodology is being applied to the Zodiac case right now. Second, the fingerprints. Multiple fingerprints were lifted from evidence in the Zodiac case. Prints were found on letters. Prints were found on a vehicle. These prints were processed using 1960s technology and compared against fingerprint databases that existed at the time. But fingerprint databases in the 1960s were minuscule compared to what exists today. If the Zodiac had never been fingerprinted before 1969, or if he was fingerprinted after the crimes but his prints were never connected to the old evidence, he wouldn't be in the database. The comparison would yield nothing. In 2025, fingerprint databases contain records from hundreds of millions of people. AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, has exponentially more prints than any database available in 1969. The old fingerprints from the Zodiac case are being rescanned with modern high-resolution technology and compared against these massive modern databases. Additionally, modern fingerprint enhancement techniques can sometimes reveal details in old prints that weren't visible with 1960s technology. Chemical treatments, alternate light sources, and digital enhancement can pull additional ridge detail from prints that were considered fully analyzed decades ago. Third, the handwriting analysis. The Zodiac letters contain extensive handwriting samples. In 1969, handwriting analysis was conducted by human experts comparing the Zodiac letters to handwriting samples from suspects. This was subjective, time-consuming, and limited by how many comparison samples investigators could obtain. In 2025, artificial intelligence and machine learning have revolutionized handwriting analysis. AI systems can analyze handwriting characteristics at a level of detail impossible for human analysts. They can compare samples against massive databases of historical documents, looking for matches to the distinctive features of the Zodiac's handwriting. Some investigators are using AI to compare the Zodiac's handwriting against millions of historical documents, military records, business records, any written materials from people who lived in Northern California in the 1960s. If the Zodiac left handwriting samples anywhere, modern AI might be able to make connections that human analysts couldn't. Fourth, vehicle evidence. In one of the confirmed Zodiac crimes, the perpetrator wrote on a car door. Paint analysis was conducted at the time, but modern chemical analysis can extract far more information from paint and ink than was possible in 1969. Modern techniques can determine the exact chemical composition of the pen used. They can potentially identify the manufacturer and even narrow down when that specific type of pen was sold. They can analyze any trace materials mixed with the ink, materials that might have come from the perpetrator's hands or clothing. Additionally, if the perpetrator touched the vehicle, there might be trace DNA from skin cells that wasn't detectable in 1969, but can be analyzed today. Modern touch DNA analysis can extract genetic profiles from evidence that was considered DNA-free 50 years ago. Fifth, the physical evidence from crime scenes. Clothing, projectiles, any physical items collected in 1968 and 1969 are being re-examined. Modern forensic techniques can find DNA, fingerprints, trace evidence, and chemical signatures that 1960s technology couldn't detect. If the perpetrator touched any items at the crime scenes, modern touch DNA analysis might be able to extract his genetic profile even 55 years later. If he left any biological material, any fibers from his clothing, any trace evidence, modern analysis can characterize it in ways that weren't possible decades ago. Quick question before we continue. What time is it where you are right now? Let us know in the comments. I'm curious how many of you are watching this late at night, fascinated by the idea that a 55-year-old case might finally be solved. How many are watching during your day? Drop the time in the comments. Now let's talk about why 2025 specifically is when this case might finally be solved, and what's different now compared to even just 5 years ago. The technology to analyze DNA from envelopes has existed for about 20 years. Genealogical databases have been growing since the mid-2000s. So why is 2025 the year when this case might finally be solved? What's changed recently that makes this the right time? Several factors have converged to make 2025 the moment when cold cases from the 1960s are finally solvable. First, the genealogical databases have reached critical mass. In 2018, when the Golden State Killer was identified, the databases contained about 15 million profiles. In 2025, that number has doubled to over 30 million. The larger the database, the more likely it is that any given DNA sample will have distant relatives in the system who can be used to build family trees. For very old cases like the Zodiac, where the perpetrator might have descendants who submitted DNA tests or distant cousins who've tested, the expanded databases make identification far more likely. Every new person who submits a consumer DNA test increases the odds that this case can be solved through genealogical analysis. Second, the DNA analysis techniques have improved even in the last 5 years. Methods for extracting DNA from degraded samples, from touch DNA, from tiny amounts of biological material have all advanced. Evidence that yielded no usable DNA profile in 2015 or 2020 might yield a complete profile in 2025 using the latest techniques. Third, there's been a generational change in law enforcement. Detectives who worked the original Zodiac investigation in the 1960s and 1970s have long since retired or passed away. A new generation of cold case investigators, trained in modern forensic techniques and familiar with genealogical DNA analysis, are taking fresh looks at this case. These modern investigators aren't emotionally invested in old theories or suspects. They're approaching the evidence with fresh eyes, asking what modern technology can tell us, not what 1960s investigators thought was important. This fresh perspective combined with modern tools is powerful. Fourth, the legal and procedural frameworks for using genealogical DNA analysis have been established. In 2018, when the Golden State Killer was identified, there were legal questions about whether this technique was permissible. By 2025, those questions have largely been resolved. Courts have accepted genealogical DNA as a legitimate investigative tool. The procedures for using it properly are well established. This means investigators can pursue genealogical analysis of Zodiac evidence without legal uncertainty. They know the technique will hold up in court if it leads to a suspect. Fifth, artificial intelligence and machine learning have matured to the point where they can be applied to complex pattern recognition problems like handwriting analysis and behavioral profiling. AI tools that didn't exist or weren't reliable 5 years ago are now being used to reanalyze everything from the Zodiac's letters to witness descriptions. And sixth, there's renewed public and institutional interest in solving this case. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and online communities have kept the Zodiac case in the public consciousness. This sustained attention creates pressure on law enforcement to use every available tool, allocates resources for advanced testing, and generates tips and new information from people who might have knowledge about the case. All of these factors combine to make 2025 the moment when this 55-year-old case might finally be solved. The technology exists. The databases are large enough. The investigative techniques are proven. The legal framework is established, and there's institutional will to pursue every possible lead. If you're finding this information valuable, if you're learning about how 55-year-old evidence can be solved with 2025 technology, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button. Seriously, I know it seems like a small thing, but it makes a massive difference. YouTube's algorithm pushes content based on engagement, and every like tells the platform that this story matters, that people still care about solving cases that have been cold for more than half a century. Your engagement helps keep this case in public awareness. It puts pressure on investigators to use every available tool. It shows that people believe no case is too old for justice. So hit that like button, drop a comment, share this video with someone who follows cold cases and needs to understand that 55 years isn't too long. Now, let's talk about what specific modern technologies are being applied to Zodiac evidence right now, and what results we might see in 2025. The most promising avenue for solving this case is genealogical DNA analysis. If investigators can extract a usable DNA profile from the envelopes or stamps the Zodiac licked, they can upload that profile to genealogical databases and look for partial matches to distant relatives. The process works like this. The DNA profile from the Zodiac evidence is compared against millions of profiles in databases like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. The system identifies people who share enough genetic markers with the Zodiac to be related, typically distant cousins or more distant relatives. Genetic genealogists then take those DNA matches and build family trees. They work backward from the DNA matches to identify common ancestors, then forward through generations to identify all living descendants of those ancestors. They narrow down the possibilities using age, location, and other factors until they arrive at a small pool of potential suspects. For the Zodiac case, genealogists would be looking for men who were approximately 20 to 40 years old in 1968, who lived in or had access to the Bay Area at that time. The family trees built from DNA matches would be filtered for individuals meeting those criteria. Once genealogists identify a potential suspect through this process, investigators would need to obtain a direct DNA sample from that person for comparison to the crime scene DNA. This is typically done through collecting abandoned DNA from items the person discards in public, which requires no warrant and has been upheld repeatedly by courts. If the abandoned DNA matches the Zodiac DNA, investigators have their perpetrator. This exact process has solved dozens of cold cases in recent years. Cases from the 1970s, 1980s, even 1960s have been solved this way. There's no reason it couldn't work for the Zodiac if usable DNA can be extracted from the evidence. The challenge is that the evidence is 55 years old. DNA degrades over time, especially if it wasn't stored under ideal conditions. The envelopes have been handled by many people over the decades, potentially contaminating the samples. The stamps might contain only minute amounts of DNA. But modern DNA extraction techniques are remarkably powerful. Forensic labs can now extract and analyze DNA from samples that would have been considered impossible to test even 10 years ago. If there's any DNA on those envelopes and stamps, 2025 technology has a reasonable chance of extracting it. Beyond DNA, advanced fingerprint analysis is ongoing. The fingerprints lifted in 1968 and 1969 are being rescanned at much higher resolution than was possible decades ago. They're being compared against modern databases that contain exponentially more prints than existed in the 1960s. Modern fingerprint enhancement can sometimes reveal ridge details that weren't visible in original lifts. Chemical treatments and alternate light sources can pull additional information from old evidence. If the Zodiac was ever fingerprinted after 1969, or if his prints are in databases that weren't thoroughly searched in the past, modern analysis might make a match. Handwriting analysis powered by AI is another active area. The Zodiac's distinctive handwriting is being analyzed by machine learning systems trained on millions of handwriting samples. These systems can identify subtle characteristics and patterns that human analysts might miss. Some researchers are comparing the Zodiac's handwriting against historical documents from Bay Area residents in the 1960s, military records, employment records, any written materials that might contain a match. This is a massive undertaking that would be impossible without AI, but it's feasible in 2025. There's also renewed analysis of the Zodiac's cryptograms. While some have been solved, others remain undeciphered. Modern cryptographic analysis, including AI-assisted techniques, is being applied to these codes. If they contain the Zodiac's real name or other identifying information, solving them could provide crucial leads. Before we wrap this up, I want to know something. Do you follow other cases from the 1960s that might be solvable with modern technology? Cases that have been cold for 50 or 60 years but could be cracked with 2025 forensic science? Drop the case name in the comments. I'm curious what other decades-old mysteries are on your radar. Now, let's piece together what all this means for the possibility of solving the Zodiac case in 2025, and what signals to watch for that might indicate a breakthrough is coming. The Zodiac case has been cold for 55 years. That's an extraordinarily long time. Many people have given up hope that it will ever be solved. The perpetrator, if still alive, would be in his 70s or 80s. Many potential suspects from the original investigation have passed away. This case seems to many observers permanently unsolvable. But that perspective doesn't account for how dramatically forensic technology has advanced. Evidence that yielded nothing in 1969 or 1989 or 2009 can yield actionable information in 2025. DNA that couldn't be detected 50 years ago can be extracted and analyzed today. Databases that didn't exist or were too small to be useful have grown to the point where they can identify suspects through distant relatives. This case is solvable. Not certainly, not guaranteed, but solvable. The evidence exists. The technology exists. The methodology has been proven in dozens of other cold cases. What's needed is thorough, systematic application of every modern technique to every piece of evidence. That process is happening right now. Multiple law enforcement agencies and private forensic labs are working on Zodiac evidence with 2025 technology. DNA extraction attempts are underway. Genealogical analysis is being prepared. Fingerprints are being reanalyzed. Handwriting is being compared using AI. If any of these efforts produces actionable results, this case could see a major development in 2025. An arrest is possible. An identification is possible. After 55 years, the Zodiac could finally be named. What would signal that a breakthrough is imminent? Several things to watch for. First, announcements from law enforcement about new testing of evidence. If agencies publicly state they're pursuing advanced DNA testing or genealogical analysis, that suggests they believe they have viable samples and a realistic chance of success. Second, requests for public assistance with genealogical research. If investigators have DNA matches to distant relatives but need help building family trees or narrowing down suspects, they might appeal to the public for information about specific families or individuals. Third, surveillance of potential suspects. If genealogical analysis has narrowed the pool to a few individuals, investigators would conduct surveillance to collect abandoned DNA for direct comparison. Increased activity around specific individuals might leak to the media before an arrest. Fourth, legal activity around old evidence. If prosecutors are preparing for a potential arrest in a 55-year-old case, they'd need to ensure all evidence is legally sound, that chain of custody is documented, that modern testing was conducted properly. Legal motions or court filings might signal an impending development. And fifth, increased media access to investigators. Sometimes when law enforcement believes a case is close to being solved, they grant media access to build public interest and prepare for an announcement. Documentaries, podcasts, or news specials that feature active investigators rather than just cold case retrospectives might indicate something is developing. After 55 years, this case could finally be solved. Justice is possible. If you haven't subscribed to Cold Case yet, what are you waiting for? We cover cases just like this one, cases that went cold for decades, cases where modern technology is finally bringing answers. And you don't want to miss what happens if the Zodiac case breaks open in 2025. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you're alerted the moment there's a development in this case or when we cover other cold cases being solved with modern technology. This case has been cold for 55 years, but 2025 technology might finally crack it. Subscribe now and be here when it happens. We've covered a lot of ground in this investigation. 55 years of waiting. Evidence collected in 1968 and 1969 with the technology available at the time. Decades of that evidence sitting in storage, analyzed but never with modern techniques. And now, in 2025, a comprehensive re-examination using DNA analysis, genealogical databases, AI-powered handwriting analysis, and advanced fingerprint techniques that didn't exist when these crimes occurred. This case represents both the frustration and the hope of cold case work. The frustration that decades can pass without resolution. The hope that evidence preserved properly can eventually yield answers when technology catches up. The victims in this case deserved safety. Their families deserved quick justice. They didn't get it in 1968 or 1969. They've waited 55 years for answers that seemed like they would never come. But technology has finally caught up to evidence from the 1960s. DNA can be extracted from 55-year-old stamps and envelopes. Genealogical databases can identify suspects through relatives 6 generations removed. AI can analyze handwriting against millions of samples. Fingerprints can be enhanced and compared against databases 1,000 times larger than existed in 1969. After 55 years, this case could be solved. Not definitely, not guaranteed, but possibly. And that possibility is real because dedicated investigators refuse to let this case stay cold, because forensic science has advanced to the point where decade-old evidence can speak, and because the evidence was preserved properly from the beginning. The Zodiac case has haunted American culture for 55 years. It's become a symbol of the limits of criminal investigation, proof that some cases might never be solved. But in 2025, it might finally become something else. Proof that no case is too old for justice, that evidence preserved for 55 years can finally reveal truth, that persistence and modern technology can crack even the coldest cases. The wait has been 55 years, but it might finally be over. Technology has caught up. The evidence is being tested right now with 2025 forensic techniques, and somewhere in those 55-year-old stamps and envelopes, might be the DNA that finally identifies the Zodiac. Justice delayed is not justice denied. After 55 years, answers might finally come. If this case moved you, if you believe 55 years isn't too long to wait for justice, if you want to be here when this case potentially breaks open in 2025, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case. We're tracking this case and every development. When investigators announce breakthroughs, when new testing reveals results, when this case potentially moves from cold to solved, you'll know about it first if you're subscribed. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think this case will be solved in 2025? What technology do you think will crack it? Share this video with anyone who follows cold cases and believes that modern technology can solve mysteries that have been frozen for more than half a century. 55 years. The evidence has been waiting. Technology has been advancing. And in 2025, they might finally converge to solve one of America's most infamous cold cases. The Zodiac case has been cold longer than most people have been alive, but it's not frozen. It's solvable, and the tools to solve it exist right now.